from Lydia's point of view, the book alternates between Lydia and Clive. Lydia, who thinks she's an ordinary young lady, and Clive, who is one of the Fae. And I thought I would read a very small section from Clive's point of view. This is a little later in the book, but still in the beginning. Clive exhaled into the gray morning as Lydia kicked over the bench. He hadn't known her long, and the depth of her anger surprised him, just as she had surprised him yesterday. But then again, she wasn't truly Fae, at least not yet. She wore her humanity like a second skin, and perhaps that was Oberon's fault. He had let her stay far too long. Clive wanted to kick something as well, but giving emotions free rein wasn't something that came easily to his people. In Fairy, magic made stray wishes or undisciplined thoughts manifest. Any Fae who couldn't exercise control lived an uncharacteristically short life. Lydia would have to learn how to channel her passions if she wanted to survive in Oberon's court. He followed her as she ran back into the wet morning. Her feet churned the saturated ground to a thick clay. Without stopping to think, he firmed up the ground beneath her soggy sneakers, but he held himself from diverting the raindrops around her. That she would notice, and given her state of mind, would definitely not be a good thing. Lydia ran with all the grace of the Fae. Even Oberon's glamour couldn't inhibit her true nature. Her legs seemed to float over the uneven terrain, and he had to push himself to keep pace with her. Clive wasn't sure how it all went so horribly wrong. He had been certain she would have embraced her Fae nature. As much as even he liked the mortal world, he could not imagine always being so aware of the end of things. But at least she had rejected Aileen, too. Regardless of what Lydia thought she wanted, she was going to have to choose, him or Aileen, Oberon or Titania. So it was a race between bright and shadowed courts. So be it. For as long as Clive could remember, there was no conflict in Fairy that wasn't somehow a struggle between Oberon and Titania. There was a time when they were lovers, when there was only one royal Fae court, but that was more than his lifetime ago. Even the Fae who lived through that time rarely spoke of it, lest they incur Oberon's fury. Since then, things between the two courts had never escalated into overt war. No, that wasn't their way. The Fae fought through sniping and skirmishes, battles of words that shifted the balance from one court to another. Now Oberon held most of the openings between the worlds, and most of the power. Most, but not all. Else Titania's emissary would never have been able to so much as dip her toes here. But thanks to the Darklings, she had found Lydia easily enough, more easily than she should have. It must have cost Titania half the tithe of her court to send them. Lydia was nearly home, and Clive hesitated under the cover of an old maple. Although its bare limbs looked almost dead, he could feel the sap running beneath its skin. Clive knew better than to trust the surface seeming of things. He waited as Lydia slammed the mudroom door behind her. This task was turning out to be far more than the simple retrieval Oberon had led him to believe. But if he had to face Oberon's displeasure, Aileen would have to deal with Titania's. Well, Lydia seemed to have handled Aileen just fine. Clive smiled. She couldn't have known just how annoyed his Shadow Court counterpart had been. Lydia shed her muddy shoes just inside the door. Clive hesitated, watching her strip off the sodden t-shirt to the tank top beneath. He could see beneath the edges of the glamour. She was lovely, all the shades of brown in Fairy, from her eyes to her hair to her bronzed skin. If you don't turn around right now and leave, I'll call the police and have them slap a restraining order on you. Lydia stood in the doorway, her hands on her hips, her voice simmering with suppressed rage. Clive smiled and stepped away from the tree. You knew I was here. There are a few Fae who could break through my glamour. It was true, and he didn't say it to brag, though he was pretty certain Lydia wouldn't see it that way. I've had enough of you and your friend Aileen today. Can't you leave me alone? Aileen and I are not friends, though friends didn't exactly translate between the realms of mortal and fairy. I told you, her queen is the one who sent the Darklings. Lydia shuddered, her anger collapsing back in on itself to find its true shape, fear. Her face paled and her voice dropped to a whisper. I tried to pretend it didn't happen, that this was all some weird joke. I'm sorry. With the openings between the worlds narrower than they once had been, and with the sheer amount of iron everywhere, Clive couldn't shield her from the Darklings, and it didn't help that Lydia stubbornly held to mortal limitations. It's no joke. Darklings aren't a joke. Once they latch on, they will hold until whoever sends them calls them off, or until they have drunk their fill of power. He stared into the distance as if he could see into the heart of the Shadow Court. Oberon wanted Lydia. Titania would risk anything to make sure he didn't get her. But using the Darklings here was risky. They would drain your magic dry, but I have no idea what they might do to a mortal. Lydia crossed her arms over her chest. What do you want from me? I want to take you home. I am home. The sound of slamming doors and high-pitched laughter of a child interrupted them. Clive glanced toward the driveway. A little girl not much older than 6 skipped over to them and threw herself at Lydia. Lids! Lydia glared at Clive before scooping up her little sister and swinging her in an arc. Peals of the child's laughter rang out in the overcast afternoon. He watched them, a strange bubble rising in his chest, an emotion he didn't quite have a name for. Driven by more than the need to remain unnoticed in this world, he cloaked himself again, careful not to focus his attention on Lydia this time. Her eyes swept over the spot where she had last seen him and slid past the concealing shadows, frowning. She turned back to her sister. Taylor, get inside before you get soaked. The little girl hugged Lydia and turned to look directly into Clive's eyes. She smiled and waved before bounding into the house. She sees me. A chill moved through him. She sees me.